Roberta Picardi is Associate Professor of History of Philosophy at the University of Molise and a member of Steering Committee of the Società Italiana di Studi Kantiani. Her main field of investigation is classical German philosophy and its legacy in contemporary philosophy. She is currently working on a project, Democracy and Citizenship, Kantian and Post-Kantian Perspectives, directed by University of Catania. Her research, which lies at the intersection of metaphysics, philosophy of history, political philosophy, and ethics, has in recent years focused on cosmopolitan right and migration, combining systematic perspective and historical philosophical approach. In particular, on this topic, she has published The Right to the Possibility of Acquiring Rights, Cosmopolitan Right in Migration in Fichte's Doctrine of Rights. This is an article in European Journal of Philosophy. And she also edited Migrazione e diritto cosmopolitico sull'attualità della filosofica politica di Kant, and the symposium Kant and Immigration. The title of her talk is Cosmopolitan Right and Peace. So, Roberta, you have the floor.
So, thank you very much, Martin. I would like, first of all, to thank the organizer for inviting me. I'm very happy to take part to this conference. And actually, I had a lot of problems in these last weeks because of the flood in Bologna. And I also thought to Renault to come, but I decided to come because the topic interests me very much, and also I was very happy to get in contact with your group of research. Let me now introduce my paper. As the title announces, the topic of my paper is the first definitive article of Kant's Toward Perpetual Peace, which proposes, as everyone knows, as necessary condition of stable peace beyond the establishment of a republican constitution within states and of a federalism of 3 states, a third ingredient, the ingredient that Kant calls cosmopolitan right. Precisely the third definitive article of Toward Perpetual Peace states that cosmopolitan right has to be limited to universal hospitality, which for Kant is to be understood as the right of a foreigner not to be treated with hostility because he has arrived on the land of another. That is, as a mere right to visit, Besuchsrecht. Today we would speak of a right of first entry or of a right of access, and not as a right of sojourn and settlement, what Kant calls Gastrecht. Since the late 90s, Kant's notion of cosmopolitan right has received increasing attention, fostered mostly by the rise of the topic of migration to the center of public philosophical discourse. There is a wide agreement in the literature in considering the introduction of cosmopolitan right as the third category of public right, in addition to constitutional right and international right, as one of the main innovations of Kant's doctrine of right. On the contrary, there is still no agreement what concerns its content and its role in fostering perpetual peace. Actually, this is not surprising. In Toward Perpetual Peace, Kant explains quite eloquently why the Republican form and the Federation of States promote peace. On the contrary, he doesn't explain with the same clarity why cosmopolitan right is crucial in order to foster and preserve stable peace. This has given rise to divergent readings, of which I will give an overview in the first part of my talk, by borrowing the distinctions that Picardi has used in his 2017 essay, How Cosmopolitanism Reduces Conflict, that is, the distinction between narrow and broad readings of cosmopolitan right. In the second part of my talk, I will take my stance in this debate by focusing on the relationship between cosmopolitan right and human rights. And finally, I will propose a qualified, narrow reading of cosmopolitan right. First of all, the state of the debate. Picardi, as I have already said, builds his reconstruction of the debate on the opposition between narrow and broad readings of cosmopolitan right. On one side, under the heading narrow reading, Kant collects the interpretation according to which cosmopolitan right, understood as a right to visit, fosters peace only insofar as it enables international trade. According to this narrow reading, international commerce results thus to be the true peace-promoting factor, whereas cosmopolitan right is just a mean in order to grant international trade. So conceived, actually, the narrow reading of cosmopolitan right is defended by few Kant scholars. On the contrary, this reading has become very popular among political scientists working in the so-called democratic peace theory, inaugurated by the international relations scholar Michael Doyle. That is, the theory grounded on the claim that democratic states do not engage in war with one another. As it is well known for Michael Doyle, the 3 definitive articles of Kant's Toward Perpetual Peace, taken together, provide the best account in order to explain why liberal states maintain peace among themselves and why the Pacific Union of Liberal Republics has expanded in the last 3 centuries. Moving from this disputable equation between liberal peace and Kant's perpetual peace, Doyle reads cosmopolitan right mainly in terms of economic interdependence. More precisely, as you can see from the passages quoted in the slide, Doyle attributes to Kant his own view that economic interdependence produces peace only when which share not only democratic constitutions, but only the principles of liberal economic theory. That is the idea of cooperative international division of labor and of free trade according to comparative advantage. Within this framework, economic interdependence impels states to try to avoid war and to enhance each other's security by means of negotiation and alliances. On the other side, under the heated broad reading, Kant gathers the numerous interpretations whose central idea is that cosmopolitan right is something more than international trade or a way of securing it. Although this something more and its role in fostering peace can be and has been understood in different ways. Regardless of the differences, most of the broad readings of cosmopolitan right share a common core which deserves to be noted more than Kant does. That is, the view that Kant's cosmopolitan rights expresses the acknowledgement of the legal international subjectivity of individuals as human rights holders. This view rests mostly on the passages of Toward Perpetual Peace, where Kant introduces cosmopolitan right as a specific and new layer of public right, which, unlike the right of nations, does not concern relations between states, but rather direct external relations of reciprocal influence between state and individuals, addressing thus individuals as citizens of a universal state of mankind, independently of their nationality and political membership into a particular state. Now, this framework can be completed and better articulated by distinguishing 2 different trends within the variety of broad readings of cosmopolitan right, which addresses the issue of its nexus with peace. So on one side, a first group encompasses all those readings who have interpreted Kant's cosmopolitan right in relation to the ideal reason of a world republic, or at least in relation to a global legal order, the Weltbürgerliche Verfassung. I refer firstly to those Kant scholars, such as Wolfgang Kersting or Giuliano Marini, who in the 90s have understood Kant's cosmopolitan right as the constitutional law of a world democracy, specifying the full set of rights of world citizens within the global republic, whose establishment is seen as the truly condition for a stable peace. Secondly, I refer to the prominent exponents of global constitutionalism, such as Jürgen Habermas, who has developed his proposal of constitutionalization of international law through a long-lasting critical confrontation with Kant. The point of departure of this confrontation is the essay written on the occasion of the bicentennial of Kant's Toward Perpetual Peace, essay which Habermas opens by referring to cosmopolitan right as an innovation with far-reaching implications. As you can see from the quotation in the slide, Habermas read Kant's concept of cosmopolitan right in the light of his own view, that is, the view that democratic states grounded on human rights call for the overcoming of the weak regulation of belligerent international relations by international law and for the establishment of a global legal order. Moving from the assumption that cosmopolitan right consists in the right of a cosmopolitan constitution, in his essay, Habermas doesn't focus on the third definitive article, but rather on the second one, by criticizing Kant's Federation of Free States, both for its alleged inconsistency and in the light of our subsequent historical experiences. For Habermas, in fact, the wars and violence of the 20th century have shown that sovereign states can no longer appeal to the principle of non-interference in their internal affairs. What raises the issue of humanitarian intervention and of how it is possible to build democratic supranational institutions in order to enforce the global protection of human rights in the absence of a world state. So I will not consider Habermas because, as I have said, Habermas focused on the second article and not on the third article. Anyway, along Habermasian lines, some Kant scholars, such as the Italian political philosopher Corradetti, has recently developed and defended a constructivist and just generative reading of Kant's cosmopolitan right to visit by presenting it as the factor that brings together constitutional progressions toward a global, multilayered, and pluralistic legal order by transforming distant jurisdictions into legally porous walls. This was the first group. Let me now consider the second variety of broad reading of cosmopolitan right, developed by those scholars who, on the contrary, appreciates Kant's option for a loose League of Nations and considers it as perfectly consistent with the systematical structure of Kant's doctrine of right. On the federal interpretation, cosmopolitan right is not usually seen to encompass the whole set of human rights of world citizens, but rather only the human rights of the individuals against foreign states, that is, the human rights of individuals in their voluntary and involuntary movement across borders. From this point of view, cosmopolitan right is seen to promote peace insofar as every form of transnational interaction fosters mutual knowledge of different peoples and intercultural communication, what in its turn decreases diffidence by therefore advancing toward stable peace. Furthermore, some scholars who defend the federal interpretation stress in various ways the moral dimension of cosmopolitan right as a sort of compensation for the lack of supranational coercive institutions who should grant the global protection and implementation of human rights. This is the case, for instance, what concerns the reading defended by Anderson Gold, for whom cosmopolitan right is not only a negative right, not to be treated with hostility, but rather a positive right to a dynamic, interactive community of moral interdependence. Luigi Caranti himself proposes such a moralizing broad reading of cosmopolitan right. He argues, in fact, that by virtue of Kant's rejection of every supranational coercive power, cosmopolitan right can't rely on an institutional protection, but rather only on the existence of a global moral conscience. Global moral conscience that cosmopolitan right presupposes and straightens at the same time. Caranti establishes, in fact, a constitutive and complex nexus between cosmopolitan right and what he calls the growing of a moral global conscience. According to him, on one side, cosmopolitan right rests on the moral substratum of a universal community with a common moral conscience that condemns violations of the natural rights of human beings, as it would be attested by the final passages of the third definitive article. On the other hand, the translation of these common moral values into an article of law that is cosmopolitan right understood as part of rect, strengthens and further develops the same global concepts, taking cosmopolitan right beyond the sheer recognition of a universal right to visit. From this point of view, cosmopolitan right in itself is a peace-promoting factor insofar as it fosters the moral improvement both of peoples and individuals, moral improvement which for Kant is the basis of Kant's whole project toward perpetual peace. Furthermore, according to Kant, taking into account the connection between cosmopolitan right and the growing of the global moral concepts allows also to gain a proper understanding of the nexus between cosmopolitan right and international trade, by revealing that and why, for Kant, international trade can produce peace-promoting effects only if it is conducted, quotation, in accordance with some basic moral rules of respect and reciprocity already part of the global concepts. Now, this was the overview. Now, after this overview of the most fortunate forms of the narrow and broad reading of cosmopolitan right with relation to peace, let me now express my stance by addressing the issue which reading should one prefer. On one side, I share with Kant the idea that Kant's cosmopolitan right can be reduced to a mere plea in favor of free international trade. More generally, I appreciate and share most of the arguments that in his book, Kant's Political Legacy, Kant has developed in order to highlight the distance of Kant's project of perpetual peace and the liberal democratic peace. On the other side, however, I do not agree with those readings, including Kant's one, which extend and overburden the content of cosmopolitan right by means of linking it with the current human rights provisions. I don't think it's necessary to spend much time in discussing the first variety of broad readings of cosmopolitan right, because there is currently wide agreement in the literature on the fact that Kant doesn't conceive cosmopolitan right as the constitutional law of a world federative republic. The strongest argument is hereby the fact that Kant introduces cosmopolitan right only in the essay toward perpetual peace, where he abandons the option of a universal republic in favor of that of a weak League of Nations. What happens not only for pragmatic reasons concerning the feasibility of a world state, but rather by virtue of its distinctive moral, intrinsic juridical view of state sovereignty, exploring like Kleingeld and Kattenflickschuh have shown. Rather, I prefer to spell out the historical and systemic reasons that make the connection between Kantian cosmopolitan right and human rights problematic and loose. Let me start with the historical reason by placing Kant's cosmopolitan right against the background on the modern natural law and jus tradition. As it is well known in his third definitive article, by limiting cosmopolitan right to universal hospitality, Kant joins a centuries-long discussion on the jus hospitalitatis, which was at the same time a discussion over who counts as an enemy who may be justly conquered in war. Kant enters this discussion by taking a position that can be labeled by borrowing the expression disharmony, which Caroline Reinhardt has used to define the eccentricities of Kant's cosmopolitan right in relation to the main lines of contemporary philosophical debate on open and closed borders. On one side, in fact, Kant limits and narrows the right of hospitality by presenting it not as a positive right to anything, but rather only as a negative right, both of the newcomer and of the old inhabitants, not to be treated with hostility. His aim is clearly to rule out the justification of colonial wars and conquests in the name of the alleged violation of the sacred right of hospitality, in the extensive version theorized by Vittoria and Grozio. The broad readings of Kant's cosmopolitan right, which sees cosmopolitan right as source of positive obligation and associates it with expensive projects of institutionalizing of human rights, seems to ignore the fact that Kant deliberately narrows the content of cosmopolitan right so that it could never be invoked to start a new war in the name of pursuing one's rights. On the other side, however, Kant doesn't share the shift from the jus hospitalitatis to the discretionary power of the state that had been inaugurated by Pufendorf through the reduction of the duties of hospitality to imperfect duties of benevolence. This emerges very clearly from the beginning of the third definitive article, where Kant argues that also in the third article, as in the preceding ones, it is not a question of philanthropy, but of right. As Caroline Reinhardt has shown, the duties entailed by cosmopolitan right are perfect and thus enforceable duties, even insofar as they are mere negative duties of omission. That is, the duty not to treat with hostility the foreigner and the duty of the foreigner not to treat with hostility those already settling in the land. The moralizing broad reading of cosmopolitan right, such as Carrante's one, risks, on the contrary, to miss its nature of strict right, which imposes on international agency very stringent constraints in spite, or better, by virtue of its meager content. Let me now spell out the systematic reason which suggests to weaken the link between cosmopolitan rights and human rights. First of all, as many scholars have rightly noticed, Kant doesn't conceive cosmopolitan right only as a right of individuals within and toward foreign states, as for instance Fichte does in his Foundations of Natural Right. Kant's cosmopolitan right encompasses rather also states' rights toward foreigners. Furthermore, it encompasses also the right of groups, including groups who are not organized in states, such as the American Indian nations or the nomadic tribes of hunters, to which Kant refers in paragraph 62 of his Doctrine of Right, devoted to cosmopolitan right. Secondly, the primary basis of cosmopolitan right doesn't lie in the innate human right to external freedom, according to the theory defended by authoritative scholars such as Pauline Klein-Gell, but rather in the concept of right itself, which has a logical priority with regard to the innate right to external freedom, what is evident if one considers the second part of the definition of the innate right to freedom. So innate right to freedom is conceived by Kant as independence from being constrained by another's choice, insofar as it can consist with the freedom of every other in accordance with universal law. What shows that innate right of freedom presupposes the concept of right. Now, this thesis, which has been defended by Catherine Fleischur and also by Caroline Reinhardt, is important from my point because it weakens at the roots the nexus between cosmopolitan right and human rights for three reasons. Firstly, because the concept of right is an inherently relational concept, which confers also to the innate right of freedom an inherent relational dimension. Secondly, because the concept of right doesn't express, as everybody knows, subjective rights, but rather the mutual obligations and the limitation of outer freedom under universal law, which are required in order to make possible the coexistence of the free choices of persons. To acknowledge the systematic priority of Kant's concept of right and the foundational role of the concept of right with regard to cosmopolitan right means thus to acknowledge a distinctive feature that doesn't allow to conflate cosmopolitan right with liberal human rights provisions. That is the fact that Kant's juridical philosophy is not a right-based approach, but rather a duty-based approach, where right is subordinated to duty. Persons represent the legitimating point of departure not insofar as they are rights holders, but rather insofar as they are capable of assuming obligations. Finally, as Kant defines it, the concept of right has to do only with external relations of persons whose actions can influence each other by abstracting both from the internal moral disposition of the subjects of the interaction and from the context of their choices. This is a relevant point which nourishes my skepticism about the broad readings of cosmopolitan right, which stress its moral dimension by associating cosmopolitan right to the growing of a global moral sensitiveness against the violations of human rights. Insofar as it belongs to the concept of right, which is its primary basis, cosmopolitan right does not concern spiritual interactions, moral interdependence, and the growing moral conscience. When Kant, in the final passages of the third definitive article, states that the community of the nations of the earth has now gone so far that a violation of right on one place of the earth is felt in all, he doesn't refer to a global moral conscience, he refers rather to a growing material and physical interdependence of our external freedoms, by virtue of which it's an illusion to think that one can contain the consequence of violations of right committed in other regions of the world. Every violation of right, inevitable, has repercussions and spreads to the point of affecting even those states that delude themselves that they are safe and think they can benefit of it. Now, in the light of the previous considerations, which in my view makes very problematic the nexus between human rights and cosmopolitan right, I would like to spell out the distinctive narrow reading that, according to my view, allows to gain a better understanding of how and why Kant's cosmopolitan right is a necessary ingredient for peace. This narrow reading rests on the acknowledgement of the interdependence and functional differentiation of the three layers of public right, whose establishment Kant considers as necessary in order to overcome the condition of war which marks the state of nature. At least in the essay on perpetual peace, Kant introduces the postulate of public right and the division of the three layers of public right, moving from the Hobbesian assumption that the state of nature is a condition of war because it involves the constant threat of an outbreak of hostilities. Thus, a condition where we can legitimately nourish a presumption of hostility toward everyone who approximates us without being subject to common authority and common law, even if they have not yet actively wronged us. Likewise, in the doctrine of right, the state of nature is considered as a condition of unavoidable conflictual freedom and provisional property claims among moral equals, which requires the institutional of a public omnilateral will, insofar as the unilateral will of individual cannot coerce anyone. Now, at the domestic level, this condition of latent war can be avoided through the institution of a sovereign state, whose moral personality is inherently coercive by virtue of the omnilateral will it represents. At the interstate level, the problem of the threat of war can be avoided through the free state federation. I come to the conclusion. But this construction is incomplete because it still leaves a double gap. Firstly, a state of nature between states and non-state peoples. Secondly, a state of nature between people who are not members of the same legal civil state, whose possible interaction represent a borderline situation between the civil state and the state of nature. Implicated persons are, in fact, on the one hand, part of a civil legal state, insofar as they are citizens of their own country. On the other hand, they are in the state of nature because they are not yet in a legal relationship with the community that receives or rejects them. Kant's cosmopolitan right is a necessary ingredient of this peace receipt insofar as it fills this gap, which could undermine the whole framework and produce the collapse of the other two layers. Within this systematic framework, international trade and economic exchanges are not the only focus of cosmopolitan right. However, they come to the forefront. And this is consistent with the architecture of Kant's doctrine of right, insofar as both private and public right have to do with what Kant calls the external dein and mine, that is, the property right of external things, which for Kant rests first of all on the acquisition of the land. This acknowledgement of the economic and commercial exchanges doesn't mean at all to attribute to Kant the liberal trust in the peaceful effects of free trade between liberal democracies. Kant is neither Montesquieu nor Doyle. On the contrary, the central concern which underlies Kant's reflection of cosmopolitan right can be grasped even in a sphere of the acceleration and implementation of warfare produced by the growth of international commerce without the limitation of right, as it results from these passages of his Vorarbeiten zum ewigen Frieden. Overstepping the bounds of hospitality has brought to the human species, and indeed to Europe, wars which Europe has not merely waged against others, but finally brought upon itself. Wars that, with the awakening of commerce, threaten to become more and more frequent and to follow faster upon one another. So trade without right can make war faster and more frequent. So cosmopolitan right is Kant's answer to this concern, and Kant's answer is not a fair trade achieved according to the requirements of a global moral concept, but rather international trade within the limits of right.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberta, for this rich and well-structured argument. So, time for debate. Are there any questions already? Okay. I see Corina behind. Do we have a mic? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roberta. Great paper. What I'm wondering about is which role history plays in your argument. Since, to me, there seem to be two notions, one of perpetual peace, and that's peace through law, and that might be what then can be reached through what you propose in your final argument. But I think then, so when Kant introduces commerce as something positive in towards perpetual peace, it's the trick of reason in history. So that somehow, when we act in a self-interested way, that will bring about, through the back door, let's say, that's always how I got his argument, us closer to perpetual peace, like laying kind of empirical ground to then make peace through law more realistic or something like that. So there seems to be perpetual peace as a legal construction, as you showed it, and there seems to be peace, which is not perpetual, but a state where war is absent and trade is prosperous. And that seems to be like a historical developing argument. What role does it play for you?
So, do I answer immediately? Or?
Yes, I think you can answer immediately.
So thank you very much, Corina, for this question. Actually, I am aware of the apparent contradiction between the last quotation and the famous passages in the first supplement of Toward Perpetual Peace, where Kant speaks of the spirit of trade as one of the peace-promoting factors, or of the mean of which nature that nature uses in order to promote the implementation of cosmopolitan right. In my view, it is important to distinguish the two perspectives. So the perspective of the philosophy of right, the doctrine of right, and Kant's perspective in philosophy of history. I would not mingle the two perspectives, and I also think that the passages of the Roberta that I quoted show very well what was Kant's concern, and also in a period in which actually in which the most important war between the European powers were fighting for commercial controversy. I quoted this passage also because, in my opinion, it shows the actuality of Kant's stance, the fruitfulness of Kant's stance, that is to underline that material interconnections can produce a situation in which the violation of right is also not convenient. So I would say that we can conceal these passages with the passages about the spirit of trade by considering that here Kant stresses that Europe is the part of the world which has tied together all the other people through commercial ties. And Europe is not, through this interconnection, Europe is going to suffer the consequence of the violation of rights that Europe has committed. So this will lead also European powers to accept to implement cosmopolitan right in the sense of rule with about international trade.
Okay. Zdravko?
Thank you for your thoughts and your interpretation, your version of narrow interpretation that I'm very much sympathetic with. But I would make a step backwards to the democratic peace theory, Doyle and so on, the narrow reading which basically focus on the commercial interconnections. And the fact that allegedly the democratic nations don't wage wars among others. I would, among themselves, I would doubt the empirical foundation of this thesis. Why? Because, and even conceptual. Usually we speak, okay, the countries that have McDonald's don't wage wars with each other. But that could be explained in other ways as well, not as a theory of peace, but a theory of, let's say, imperialism. And both have basically the same result, only that in the first case, it is the war that brings the trade, and the war is, at the end, the last instance of promoting trade. And if we see history, today we are now in the tensions between, let's say, Europe and China. Why? Because of the trade. The trade is reason why there seems to be some hostilities. But this is nothing new. Basically, this is the traditional history of the relations between Europe and China. We can mention only the Opium War, which was war fought in the name of free trade. But basically, it was an imperialistic war. And in this case, this shows clearly that the trade can promote peace only under very specific condition, and it doesn't bring it by itself. So I would doubt the empirical basis of this thesis. The same holds also for the wars among democracy. They could be, okay, first empirical. Of course, we can say if we wage a war against certain country and we are democratic, that country cannot count as democratic. And in this way, we provide empirical basis. For if the theory were right, then it would reduce the probability of war against undemocratic states as well. But if we see, let's say, recent developments for, let's say, 40 years, it was constantly the democratic West that promoted wars. And this is against this theory. And then we have this only very narrow thesis that there is no war among democratic states. And this could have a very simple implication because the so-called democratic states are not able to wage wars because they are not states at all. Because they are, in which sense, you know, if you have a hegemonic structure, when there is only one very powerful state and no other democratic state dares to question its supremacy, whether political or economic, you have no war. But this is only the absence of hostilities and not peace.
I totally agree with your empirical analysis. Actually, I can only say that in his essay, Kant, Liberal Legacies and Foreign Affairs of 1983, Michael Doyle admits that trade is not always good for peace, but the explanation is that trade is not always good for peace because not all states are democratic states. So he would explain the warfare triggered by the commercial competition between Western states and China by insisting on the fact that China is not a democratic state. So this is not my view, but this would be Doyle's answer. But in my opinion, it is important to stress that it is not Kant's view. That's why I mentioned I quoted the passages of the Vorarbeiten. And actually, it is also important to underline that Kant is not a supporter of international free trade in itself, as it emerges very clearly from the fact that it justifies China's and Japanese protectionism. And in many other passages, he thinks that it can be justified to promote protectionism. But actually what your remarks at the end about the problem of the hegemony, the hegemonic structure of the League of Democratic Nations are very interesting, and so they can perhaps, these are the objections that already, for instance, Fichte in the Rechtslehre 1812 develops against Kant's idea of a League of Nations by remarking that the difference of power between the members of the League of Nations could promote war, or at least not promote the realization of the principle of right, that is the principle of equal freedom.
Thank you. Okay. Well, we could continue the debate, but if there are no pressing questions right now, I think we can just catch the schedule if we conclude, and thank again Roberta.